Welcome back, everybody, to the Book of Fables. We have a really interesting one to take a look at this week. It was a fable that I wasn't sure I was going to be able to find enough information about, but what little I've been able to dig up has been very interesting indeed. So let's jump right in. Most of the fairy tales we've looked at so far have been either medieval or ancient in time period, and so they deal with themes and settings which, to the extent that we can still understand them, are universal, and to the extent that we cannot, we really have to delve into the mindset of the times, and we have to understand what people back in medieval times or back in ancient Anglo-Saxon times would have been concerned about. And so the fairy tales have been a really interesting reflection on the culture at that time. But this week I thought we would look at something a little bit more modern. One of the characters that we have met several times in The Wolf Among Us so far has been Dr. Swinehart, and he comes from a story set in the middle of the 1800s, which is the Three Army Surgeons, the Drei Feldscherer. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but it's a German fairy tale. It has its own category in the Fables, fairy tales setting, KHM 118. It's kind of by itself there, and it is a tale collected in the Brothers Grimm anthology, and it really reflects some more modern but not quite mindsets. It's this really interesting bridge between the old school of fairy tales and then what we think of today and the sort of stories we tell today. So because it's less common and people don't know it as much, I think I'll probably tell it really quickly. And it goes a little something like this. There are, in fact, three army surgeons who are out traveling, and they're not engaged in the army. They're free to wander about as they will. And they come to an inn, and they sit down, and the innkeeper, pay for their room and board, and the innkeeper says, "What do you do?" They say, "Oh, we're army surgeons, and further, we have learned everything that there is to learn about our craft. We are absolute master surgeons." And the innkeeper says, "Well, please, show me what you can do." And eager to show off their prowess, the three say, "All right, we are actually able to attach and detach organs, limbs, anything we want to completely at will. So here's a demonstration." And taking a strong cleaver in hand, the first man chops off his left hand, or in some cases his right hand, it depends on the story, and says, "All right, in the morning I will reattach this hand. Please keep it in the cupboard overnight." And so the innkeeper puts it in the cupboard. And the second one says, "I am going to show something a little bit closer to home," and he rips out his own heart from his chest, hands it beating to the innkeeper, and says, "In the morning I will put my heart back in, so please keep it in the cupboard." And he does, and presumably the inn is getting a little messy at this point, but the third one says, "Well, they've only given you one thing, I will give you two." And he reaches and grabs both of his eyes and rips them out of his skull, gives them to the innkeeper, and says, "In the morning I will put my eyes back in, please keep them in the cupboard until then." And so the innkeeper is obviously sort of astounded, but he does what the surgeons have told him, and everyone goes to bed for the night. The trick of the surgeons is that they have a salve which is able to do what they said, to reattach organs and limbs and eyes and everything, which they keep on them. And so they keep that in the room and they keep it near them. Now, during the course of the night, one of the barmaids is up tending the fire and cleaning up, and she is in a relationship with a soldier who comes calling and wants to talk. And so, stopping from her duties for a moment, she pulls two chairs close to the fire and thinks it would be very nice if they could have some food to eat while they talked. And so she goes and unlocks the cupboard and where they're keeping the organs, and gets some bread and some cheese and things like that, and sits down and starts to tell him about the surgeons. Well, while they're talking, a cat comes in and notices that the cupboard is unlocked, goes looking for some food, and in fact runs off with the hand, the eyes, and the heart of the surgeons, presumably devours them somewhere. They hear the cat leaving, and the barmaid goes up to investigate and absolutely panics when she realizes that, what's happened. The cat's run off. So she goes back to the soldier and says, "What are we going to do? I will certainly be fired, and, maybe worse when they discover what's happened." And so the soldier says, "All right, keep calm. There was just a man who was hanged today as a thief, and so they sneak out to the center of town and find the hanged man on the gallows and cut off his hand, the correct hand, left or right, and bring it back. And they go, okay, so much for the hand. There was just a pig that was slaughtered, and we can still get the heart from there. So they go out and get the heart from the pig and put that in the cupboard. And then they think, well, what are we going to do for the eyes? Because I guess crows had already dealt with the pig and the convict's eyes. And so with nothing more for it, they eventually find the cat that stole the organs, and having eaten them, they paid it back by taking the cat's eyes and putting those back in the cupboard. They lock it up and assume that that's that. And morning comes, and the surgeons march down, all as proud as they can be, somehow not dead of blood loss and massive organ failure and whatever. They pull out the salve, and the one puts the convict's hand onto his own and attaches it with the salve, and it mends right up. The other puts the pig's heart into his chest, and it rubs the salve over it, and it mends right up. And the third one puts the cat's eyes into his head, rubs the salve, and it mends up. Everyone is very impressed, there's much applause, and they head out on their way. So, while they are walking, the first thing that they notice is the one with the eyes of the cat can't see very well. He says, comrades, you'll need to guide me by the hand. I'm not seeing very well. Everything seems very dim and dark. And they walk a little bit farther, and there's a patch of dust with some roots and things like that. And the one with the heart of the pig suddenly feels this desire to go over and start rooting in them and digging around and looking for mushrooms or whatever, and roots and things like that. The others try to hold him back by his coattails, but he breaks off, and they can't stop him from rooting around. They get to the inn for the next night, and there is a rich man who is sort of counting his money on the table, and the one with the new hand walks up, and while the other man's looking away, makes a sudden move and grabs some of the gold coins. Comes back to his companions, and they say, what are you doing? You can't steal, that's wrong. And he says, I can't help myself, I feel compelled to. And the one with the eyes of the cat says, I'm starting to see a little bit better in here. I think I can see very clearly. And then when they go to bed for the night, he says, I can see perfectly now when it's pitch dark. He says, do you see all the mice running around? I really can't help but noticing them. And talking over the events of the day, they suddenly realize that they've been tricked, and the organs that they have are not their own. So marching back to the inn the very next day, where all this happened, they demand their organs back. And the innkeeper is not long finding out what happened, gets the barmaid, who sort of sees what's happening and runs off, and does not return to the inn and is gone from the story. And the three men say, well, you must give us a lot of money, or we're going to burn the inn down and your family with it. And so the innkeeper gets all the money that he can put together and gives it to the three surgeons. It's enough to retire on, and so they retire. But the story concludes they would rather have had their original organs. So that's weird, right? It's not a fable in the sense that there's kind of a moral, but not really. Characters aren't necessarily wicked or good. They're just varieties of ridiculous. I mean, it's kind of a funny story, and back in the time when this is told, bloody meant funny. Not that it still doesn't in some cases, but it is fairly gory. And that was about as far as I could get with it, that it was just kind of a bloody funny story. But the more I started to dig in, there are a couple themes in here that I think really have some applicability today. And the first is the idea that this was at a time when people were starting to get a different idea about medicine, and people were starting to understand the human body more, and they were starting to be able to fix things, and so they would be able, especially army surgeons who dealt a lot, and there were a lot of land wars in Europe all throughout the 16, 17, 1800s, and so they would have been very adept at reattach, if they could reattach something or sew something up, or amputating in certain cases, and it would have been seen as very unusual, the spread of this modern medicine by people who were only familiar with folk remedies. If you think about it, the assumption of the surgeons is that they have some salve, which is probably prepared by some extract of plants or something like that. It's still kind of traditional medicine because that's still the conception of how medicine works. But it's this kind of combined awe and mistrust of medicine. That it can do anything, it can work these miracles, but who knows what the cost may be. Maybe things will work out really badly. Maybe there will be these bad side effects, and people are sort of tampering around in things that they aren't meant to. And so you'll have all these negative things. It's fearful, but it's wondering at the same time, in kind of the same way that, say, Frankenstein is. That would be another more modern fairy tale that takes on this tack. Science can go far, and Frankenstein is even a little bit closer to us, because Frankenstein specifically, science has progressed to the extent that this is now possible by people. But in the three army surgeons, it's definitely, there's still this almost like mystical element of it. They still kind of sound like wandering saints, which would have been told in a medieval tale, who might have some magic salve that can do almost anything. But, I mean, they're not saints, they're not monks, they're surgeons. So it's this really evolving, sort of half-formed understanding about medicine and the things it's capable of doing, which I think is really interesting. The second thing is the particular wounds that they were suffering at the time, a wound to the hand, a wound to the eyes, and a wound to the torso, or heart in this case, would have been ones that would have been really common in a army capacity, in a land war or something like that. And the fact that they're army surgeons means that they would have been upper class people, so much less likely to get those kind of wounds in the first place. And so there might have been a little class humor in there, where these rich people have inflicted on themselves the same things that they would have been, curing to a certain extent among the poorer classes. And that's something. But the other one that I think is really interesting is the idea that a body part will carry with it some of the characteristics of the person that it came from. And that's a really powerful idea that I think is still in the consciousness. It's funny, I'm recording this now, and I was just at a function literally last night with some friends of mine, and somebody was swearing to me that he had recently heard about a heart transplant in which the heart of a famous rock climber had died, and his heart was transplanted into somebody who needed one, and the person who got the transplant suddenly became an avid rock climber, just like that. And I mean, it was presented as, do you think this is possible? Because I'm a guy who's in the sciences, and so it was like, I think this might be possible to you. So this idea that a body part carries with it this sense of the person individually. I mean, we've seen there's sort of B movie things where you'll get a heart transplant from a convicted criminal and become evil, or get a hand transplant sometimes, especially from a criminal, and then you'll start to do evil things. I think there's a movie called Idle Hands or something like that. And so there's some body horror in here too. And I think that's related to a certain extent to the whole Frankenstein idea. The idea that by this detaching and reattaching hand parts, that you can carry some of the essence of a person around, and that you can really be changed in this sort of sinister way. So yeah, that's sort of the characteristic of this story, and I just find it really fascinating that we can just start to see the evolution of like modern horror, of science gone too far, body horror, and that this has come, this is a real break from previous stories in which they were essentially morality fables. Whereas this one is not exactly a cautionary tale, but it's this tale of this kind of like comedy, horror, bloody, slapsticky mishmash of all these things. And so that's why I was very excited to hear about it. I'd be interested in doing some more modern stuff, so I'll see if I can dig up anything about that. It's interesting that I feel like after a certain point, there stops really being a point to the fairy tales anymore. So we just met Jersey Devil in The Wolf Among Us, and there's not really a whole lot I can dig up about it. He's a cryptid, and so our fairy tales now are just, there is a monster, as opposed to there being a whole lot inherent about the actual nature of our society. And so we're sort of starting to see that a little here, in that the story is now specifically about the thing that happened and not really the character of the people involved. There's a little bit of the surgeons had hubris and they thought that they were the masters of their art, and they were sort of paid back for that, but not really. I mean, it was just a series of weird events, and the thing itself almost became more important than the tale. So anyway, yeah, that is the three army surgeons. I hope you have enjoyed listening as much as I've enjoyed talking about it, and I will catch you guys next time on the Book of Fables.